The morning sun barely touched the empty streets as Maria stepped out of her small apartment. It was 3 a.m. and the world felt heavy around her shoulders. She walked down the narrow stairs, her feet knowing every creak and groan of the old wooden steps. In her arms, she carried a basket filled with flour, yeast, and the last of her hope. Maria was 34 years old, but her hands told the story of someone much older. The lines on her palms spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, not because she liked it that way, but because she didn't have time to care about how she looked anymore. 18 months ago, her life had been completely different. Back then, she lived in a small house with her husband Diego and their 2 children. 8-year-old Sofia would run around the backyard, chasing butterflies and laughing so loud that the neighbors would smile. 5-year-old Miguel would follow his father everywhere, asking a million questions about everything he saw. Diego had big dreams. He worked construction during the day and spent his evenings in their tiny kitchen, teaching Maria how to make bread the way his grandmother had taught him. His hands would guide hers as they kneaded the dough together. He would tell her stories about his childhood, about the smell of fresh bread filling his grandmother's house every morning. One day, "We'll have our own bakery," he would say, flour dusting his dark hair. "You'll see, Maria. We'll make the best bread in the whole city." Maria would laugh and tell him he was a dreamer. But secretly she loved his dreams. They made her feel like anything was possible. Then came that terrible Tuesday morning. Diego had left for work like he did every day, kissing her goodbye and promising to bring home ice cream for the kids. But instead of Diego coming home that evening, 2 men in hard hats knocked on her door. They spoke in quiet voices about an accident, about falling scaffolding, about things that didn't make sense. Diego never came home. The weeks that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, paperwork, and well-meaning friends who brought casseroles and said they were sorry for her loss. But sorry didn't pay the bills. Sorry didn't put food on the table for Sofia and Miguel. The medical bills came first. Even though Diego had died instantly, the ambulance ride and hospital fees added up to thousands of dollars. Then came the mortgage payments, the utility bills, and all the other expenses that didn't stop just because Diego was gone. Maria sold everything she could. Diego's tools went first, the ones he had saved for years to buy. Then went her wedding ring, the one her mother had helped her pick out when she was 22 and thought love could conquer anything. After that came the furniture piece by piece until their house felt empty and cold. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The bank sent letters. The utility company sent notices. The landlord of their little house, who had been patient at first, started calling every day. Maria would watch her children play in the backyard and wonder how long she could keep pretending everything was okay. That's when she remembered Diego's bread recipes. Maria had never been much of a cook before Diego taught her. But desperation makes people brave. She spent their last $50 on ingredients and started baking. At first, the bread was terrible. Too dense, too salty, or burned around the edges. But she kept trying, using the recipes Diego had written down in his careful handwriting. Slowly, the bread got better. Sofia and Miguel would come home from school to the smell of fresh loaves cooling on the counter. For a moment, it almost felt like Diego was still there with them. Maria started selling the bread to neighbors, then to people at the small grocery store downtown. Word spread slowly but surely. Her bread was good, really good. It tasted like home, like comfort, like the kind of food that made people feel better about their day. She rented a small stall at the Riverside Farmers Market. Every Saturday and Sunday, she would load up her beat-up car with bread and drive downtown. The stall cost $50 a week, money she could barely afford, but it was her only chance to make enough to survive. The other vendors were kind to her. Mrs. Chen, who sold vegetables, would save her leftover produce. Tom, who ran the coffee stand, would give her free coffee on cold mornings. They all knew her story and they all tried to help in small ways, but kindness doesn't pay rent. This particular Saturday morning felt different, heavier somehow. On Thursday, Maria had found an eviction notice taped to her door. 30 days to pay $2,400 in back rent, or she and the children would have to leave the only home they had ever known. Maria had counted her savings that night after the children went to bed. The crumpled bills and handful of coins added up to $847. She had counted 3 times, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. She had called her sister in California, swallowing her pride to ask for help. But her sister had her own problems, her own bills to pay. She cried when she told Maria she couldn't help, and Maria had spent the night feeling guilty for making her sister feel bad. Now, standing in her kitchen at 3 a.m., mixing dough with tears streaming down her face, Maria wondered what would happen to Sofia and Miguel if she couldn't find a way to keep them together. The thought of losing her children on top of everything else was too much to bear. She baked 43 loaves that morning, each one perfect, golden brown and smelling like hope. As she loaded them into the car, Sofia appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, are you okay?" the little girl asked. Maria wiped her face quickly and forced a smile. "Of course, baby. Go back to bed. I'll be home this afternoon." But as she drove through the quiet streets toward the market, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this might be one of the last times she would make this trip. The car was making strange noises. The rent was due in 30 days and she was running out of miracles. At the market, Maria set up her stall with the same care she always did. She arranged the loaves in neat rows, put up her small handwritten signs with the prices, and tried to look like a successful businesswoman instead of a desperate mother who was one bad day away from losing everything. The morning started slowly. A few regular customers stopped by, bought their usual loaves, and chatted about the weather. But by 10 o'clock, Maria could feel the familiar knot of worry in her stomach. She had only sold 12 loaves, not nearly enough to make a difference. She watched other vendors laughing with their customers, counting their money, looking confident and secure. Maria envied them. She remembered when Diego was alive, when money problems were just temporary inconveniences instead of constant terror. A woman with 2 small children walked by, and Maria's heart ached watching them. The little boy reminded her of Miguel, curious and energetic. The little girl had Sofia's serious eyes. Maria wondered if they would remember her when she was gone, or if they were too young to understand why their mother cried so often. By 11:30, the tears started coming again. Maria tried to hide them, turning away from customers, pretending to rearrange her display. But the weight of everything was crushing her. The eviction notice, the empty bank account, the scared look in her children's eyes when they thought she wasn't watching. She thought about Diego's dreams, about the bakery they would never open together. She thought about all the plans they had made, all the tomorrows they would never see. Most of all, she thought about Sofia and Miguel, and how she was failing them just like she had failed their father by not being able to save him. The bread sat on the table, perfect and golden, but it felt like it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Maria closed her eyes and tried to find the strength to make it through the rest of the day, to go home and pretend to her children that everything would be okay. But deep down, she was starting to believe it wouldn't be. Jake Williams had been driving cattle trucks for 15 years, but his story started long before that. At 41, his face was weathered like old leather, marked by sun and wind and hard work. His hands were rough and scarred from years of handling livestock and fixing broken equipment on the side of empty highways. People who met Jake usually thought he was just another truck driver, someone who moved cattle from ranch to auction house and didn't think much beyond his next paycheck. But Jake's grandmother had taught him something important when he was just a boy growing up on a small ranch in Wyoming. She told him that the measure of a man wasn't in what he owned or how much money he made, but in how he treated people when nobody else was watching. Jake's life hadn't been easy. When he was 36, he had been married to a woman named Lisa, who made him laugh every single day. They lived in a small house with a big backyard where they planned to raise children and grow old together. Lisa worked as a teacher and would come home with stories about her students that would keep them talking late into the night. Then came the car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy Thursday evening, and suddenly Jake's whole world changed. Lisa died at the hospital 3 hours later, holding his hand and telling him she loved him one last time. After Lisa's funeral, Jake couldn't stand being in their house anymore. Everything reminded him of her: the coffee cup she used every morning, the books she left half read on the nightstand, the garden she had planted that spring. He sold the house and bought a small ranch 2 hours outside the city. It wasn't much, just a modest house and enough land for a few horses, but it was quiet and far away from all the memories. The ranch became Jake's way of healing. He would spend his days off fixing fences, taking care of the animals, and trying to rebuild his life piece by piece. During the week, he drove his cattle truck, delivering livestock all over the state. It was honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. This particular Saturday morning, Jake had finished an early delivery at the stockyards. Instead of heading straight home like he usually did, something made him decide to walk through the farmer's market. Maybe it was the smell of fresh coffee, or maybe he just wasn't ready to go back to his empty house yet. The market was busy with weekend shoppers. Families with young children walked between the stalls. Couples held hands while picking out vegetables, and elderly folks sat on benches watching the world go by. Jake felt a familiar pang of loneliness watching all these people with their normal, happy lives. That's when he smelled the bread. Jake followed the scent to a small stall where a woman stood behind a table covered with golden loaves. She was arranging them carefully, adjusting the small handwritten price tags, trying to make everything look perfect. But Jake could see something was wrong. The woman was trying not to cry. She kept turning away from customers, wiping her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Her shoulders were tight with tension, and her hands shook slightly as she counted the money in her small cash box. Jake had seen that look before, in the mirror in the months after Lisa died. It was the look of someone trying to hold their whole world together when everything was falling apart. Jake studied her face while pretending to look at the bread. She was pretty in a tired way, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that had seen too much sadness. She looked like she was about his age, maybe a little younger. There was something about her that reminded him of his own mother during the hard years after his father died, when Jake was just 12. The bread looked incredible. There were different kinds: sourdough with thick crusts, whole wheat loaves that smelled like honey, and sweet rolls that looked like something his grandmother used to make. Everything was perfectly baked, golden brown, and inviting. This wasn't the work of someone who didn't care. This was the work of someone who put love into everything she made. "How much for a loaf?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. He had learned to speak softly around people who looked like they might break. The woman looked up at him, and Jake could see she had been crying recently. Her eyes were red, but she forced a polite smile. $3 for the regular bread, $4 for the specialty ones," she said, her voice barely steady. Jake nodded and looked at the display again. 43 loaves, maybe more. All of them perfect. All of them made with care by someone who clearly needed every dollar she could get. He thought about his grandmother's words about being kind when nobody else was watching. He also thought about his truck, about the envelope in his glove compartment with this week's pay. $3,000 for 5 days of hard driving. More money than he needed, really, since he lived simply and didn't spend much on anything except feed for his horses. Jake pulled out his wallet. It was old and worn, a gift from Lisa on their second anniversary. Inside were several $20 bills, some 50s and a couple of hundreds that he kept for emergencies. He looked at the woman again, at the way she was trying so hard to appear strong, and made a decision that surprised even him. "I'll take everything," he said quietly. The woman stared at him like he had spoken a foreign language. "Everything?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am, all of it." Jake started counting out bills from his wallet. "How much would that be?" The woman's hands trembled as she tried to add up the prices. She counted once, then again, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, I have 43 loaves here. That's over $150 worth of bread." Jake nodded and placed $200 on her small table. "Keep the change." For a moment, the woman just stared at the money like it might disappear if she blinked. Then she looked up at Jake with tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Jake had been asking himself the same question. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story or why she was crying. But something about her reminded him of himself in those dark months after Lisa died. Something about her made him want to help, even if he couldn't explain why. "Because everyone deserves kindness," he said simply, "and because you look like you could use some help." That simple statement broke something inside the woman. All the strength she had been trying to maintain crumbled, and the words started pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. She told him about her husband, Diego, about the construction accident that took him away from her and their 2 children. She told him about the medical bills, the eviction notice, and the $847 in her savings account that wasn't nearly enough to keep them from losing their home. She told him about Sophia and Miguel, about how scared she was of failing them, about how she laid awake at night wondering what would happen if she couldn't find a way to keep their family together. Jake listened without interrupting. He had learned that sometimes people just needed someone to hear their story, to witness their pain without trying to fix everything. He watched her face as she spoke, saw the love she had for her children, the determination that kept her going even when everything seemed hopeless. When she finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Lisa, about how she used to say that people came into your life for a reason. He thought about his empty ranch house, about all the space he had and didn't use. He thought about the nights when the silence was so complete it felt like drowning. Most of all, he thought about his grandmother's words about kindness, and about how Lisa would have wanted him to help if he could. "I've got a proposition for you," Jake said, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He couldn't believe what he was about to say, but somehow it felt right. "I own a small ranch about 2 hours north of here. Nothing fancy, but there's a main house and a guest cottage that's been empty for 3 years. The woman looked at him with confusion and hope, warring in her eyes. "I could use some help with the paperwork, and maybe some cooking," Jake continued. "The ranch work keeps me busy, but I'm terrible with numbers and I mostly eat sandwiches. If you and your children wanted to come stay in the cottage, no rent, utilities included, in exchange for helping me run the place properly." Jake watched her face change as she processed what he was saying. He could see her mind working, trying to figure out if this was real or if she was dreaming. "I don't understand," she whispered again. "You don't even know my name. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" Jake thought about all the ways he could answer that question. He could tell her about Lisa, about the loneliness that ate at him every day. He could tell her about his grandmother, about the lessons he learned growing up on a ranch where neighbors helped neighbors without expecting anything in return. He could tell her about the empty cottage that had been waiting for someone to fill it with life again. Instead, he gave her the simplest truth he could find. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it most," he said, "and I never got the chance to pay them back." Maria stood behind her bread stall, staring at the $200 on the table like it was some kind of magic trick. Her whole body was shaking, and she couldn't tell if it was from relief or fear or complete shock. This stranger, this cowboy with the kind eyes and worn hands, had just offered her more money than she usually made in a week, and now he was talking about giving her a place to live. It didn't make sense. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Maria had learned over the past 18 months that the world was mostly full of closed doors and people who said they were sorry but couldn't help. She had learned that when you were desperate, you were mostly invisible, and when people did notice you, it was usually with pity or annoyance. But this man, Jake, he had said his name was Jake, and was looking at her like she mattered, like her problems were worth solving. "I need to think," Maria said, her voice barely working. This is incredibly generous, but I have children. I can't just make a decision like this without thinking it through." Jake nodded like he understood completely. "Of course. This is a big decision. Why don't you take my number, and if you want to drive up and see the place, you can call me. No pressure at all." He pulled a business card from his wallet. It was simple and practical. Jake Williams Livestock Transport with a phone number underneath. On the back, he wrote down an address in a town Maria had never heard of. "The cottage is small but comfortable," Jake said. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room. There's a good school in town for your children. The ranch keeps me busy, but it's peaceful there. Quiet." Maria took the card with trembling fingers. She looked at Jake's face, trying to read his intentions, trying to figure out if this was real or if there was some catch she wasn't seeing. She had become suspicious over the past year, careful in ways she never had to be when Diego was alive. "Why?" she asked again. "I mean, really, why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out at the busy market around them. Maria could see him thinking, like he was trying to decide how much of his story to tell. "I lost someone too," he said finally. "My wife. Car accident 5 years ago." He looked back at Maria, and she could see old pain in his eyes. "After she died, I bought the ranch because I couldn't stand being around people who wanted to help but didn't know how. I thought I wanted to be alone." He paused, watching a family walk by with their children laughing and running between the market stalls. "But alone isn't the same as peaceful," Jake continued. "The house is too quiet and the cottage just sits there empty. I keep thinking Lisa would have wanted me to do something useful with it all, instead of just hiding out there feeling sorry for myself." Maria felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't charity, she realized. This was two broken people who might be able to help each other heal. "What would you expect from me?" she asked. "I mean, what kind of work?" "Mostly bookkeeping," Jake said. "I'm terrible with paperwork and the ranch accounts are a mess. Maybe some cooking if you wanted to, but only if you wanted to. The cottage has its own kitchen so you'd have privacy, and your children would be welcome everywhere on the property. There are horses they could learn to ride if they're interested." Maria thought about Sophia and Miguel, about how they had been cooped up in their small apartment, about how Miguel especially missed having a yard to play in. She thought about the school in their current neighborhood, which was overcrowded and underfunded, and about the fear she saw in Sophia's eyes when she thought her mother wasn't looking. "How far did you say it was from here?" she asked. "About 2 hours north. It's rural, but not isolated. The town has everything you need. Grocery store, library, doctor, dentist. Good people, mostly. The kind of place where neighbors still look out for each other." Maria tried to imagine it. A small town where people looked out for each other. A place where Sophia and Miguel could run and play without her worrying about their safety. A place where she wouldn't have to count every penny. Where she could sleep at night without listening for the landlord's footsteps on the stairs. But it also meant leaving everything familiar, trusting a stranger with her children's lives, starting over in a place where nobody knew her story. "I would need references," Maria said, surprising herself with her practicality. "I mean, if I'm going to bring my children to live with someone I don't know." Jake smiled for the first time since they had started talking. "Smart thinking. I can give you the number for Sheriff Rodriguez in town. I've known him for years. There's also Pastor Wilson at the community church, and Dr. Martinez who takes care of my horses. Any of them would tell you I'm harmless." He pulled out his phone and started writing down names and numbers on the back of another business card. "You should also know that the cottage locks from the inside and you'd have your own keys. I'm not looking for anything except help with the ranch and maybe some company for dinner once in a while. If you wanted. No strings attached, no expectations beyond what we agree on." Maria felt some of her tension ease. Jake was being practical too, thinking about her concerns, treating her like an intelligent adult instead of a charity case. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said. "Why haven't you hired someone before now? I mean, if you need help with the books and the cooking." Jake looked a little embarrassed. "Honestly, because I convinced myself I didn't need anyone. I thought if I just worked hard enough and stayed busy enough, I'd be fine on my own. But lately," he trailed off, then started again. "Lately, I've been realizing that maybe Lisa wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life hiding out there alone." Maria understood. She had been hiding too in her own way. Hiding from the possibility of a future that didn't include Diego. Hiding from the idea that she might be capable of more than just surviving day to day. "If I came to look at the place," she said slowly, "and I brought the children with me, would that be okay? I wouldn't want to make any decisions without them seeing it too." "Of course," Jake said. "Kids should have a say in where they live. Besides, if they hate it, then it wouldn't work anyway." Maria looked at the money still sitting on her table, at the bread Jake had bought, at his honest face and kind eyes. For the first time in 18 months, she felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. "What's your last name?" she asked. "I mean, if I'm going to call your references, Williams. Jake Williams." He held out his hand for her to shake. "And you are?" "Maria Santos," she said, taking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, calloused from work but careful with her smaller fingers. "It's nice to meet you, Maria Santos," Jake said, "and I hope you'll consider my offer. But either way, I want you to keep that money. Your bread is worth every penny, and you clearly work hard for everything you have." Maria felt tears starting again, but this time they were different. These weren't tears of desperation or fear. These were tears of gratitude and possibility. "I'll call your references," she said, "and if they all say good things about you, maybe we could drive up next weekend to see the place." "That would be great," Jake said. "And Maria, whatever you decide is fine. Don't feel pressured. This offer will stand whether you come next weekend or next month or not at all." As Jake walked away, disappearing into the crowd of market shoppers, Maria stood there holding his business cards and staring at the money on her table. Around her, the market continued its busy weekend rhythm, but everything felt different now. For the first time since Diego died, Maria allowed herself to imagine a future that included something more than just getting by. She imagined Sophia and Miguel running through fields instead of being cooped up in their tiny apartment. She imagined cooking in a real kitchen again, maybe even baking bread for the joy of it instead of just for survival. Most of all, she imagined feeling safe again. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. The kind of safety that came from having a place to belong, from not having to face everything alone. Maria carefully folded the money and put it in her pocket. Then she began packing up her remaining bread, the few loaves Jake hadn't bought. She would give them to Mrs. Chen and Tom and the other vendors who had been kind to her. She would go home and tell Sophia and Miguel about the nice man who bought all her bread, and maybe, if the references checked out, about a possible adventure to see a ranch with horses and wide-open spaces. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Maria Santos smiled a real smile as she packed up her stall and headed home. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself standing in the kitchen of Jake's ranch house watching through the window as Sophia and Miguel chased 3 chickens around the yard. The children's laughter echoed across the open space, a sound that had been missing from their lives for so long that Maria had almost forgotten what pure joy sounded like. The move hadn't been easy. After calling Jake's references, all of whom spoke about him like he was family, Maria had driven up to see the ranch with the children. The 2-hour drive had felt like traveling to another world. They left behind crowded city streets and apartment buildings, driving through rolling hills and farmland until they reached Jake's property. The ranch was exactly as he had described it. Modest but well-maintained, with a main house that looked like something from a country magazine and a smaller cottage about 100 yards away. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, a comfortable living room and a kitchen with windows that looked out over pastures where horses grazed peacefully. Miguel had been enchanted immediately. At 5 years old, he had never seen so much open space. He ran from room to room in the cottage, his voice echoing off the walls as he called out to Sophia to come see everything. Sophia at 8 was more cautious. She stayed close to Maria, watching Jake carefully, asking quiet questions about the horses and the chickens and whether there were other children in the area. Jake had been perfect with them. He didn't try too hard to win them over, didn't make promises he might not keep. Instead, he showed them around calmly, letting them explore at their own pace. When Miguel asked if he could pet one of the horses, Jake brought out the gentlest mare on the ranch, a sweet-tempered horse named Buttercup who nuzzled Miguel's small hand and made him giggle with delight. "She's very friendly," Jake had told Miguel. "But horses are big, so we always have to be careful and respectful around them. If you came to live here, I could teach you how to take care of her properly." Sophia had warmed up when she saw the bookshelf in the cottage living room. Jake had filled it with children's books from the town library, stories about horses and farms and adventures in the countryside. "I thought you might like to read about ranch life," he told her. "And there's a really good library in town where you can get whatever books you want." That night, driving back to the city, Sophia had been unusually quiet. Finally, as they pulled into their apartment complex, she spoke up from the back seat. "Mama," she said, "do you think Papa would want us to be happy again?" The question had broken Maria's heart and healed it at the same time. She knew then that they were going to accept Jake's offer. Now 3 weeks into their new life, Maria was still adjusting to the change. The cottage felt like a palace after their cramped apartment. She had her own washer and dryer, a dishwasher that actually worked, and more space than she knew what to do with. The children each had their own bedroom for the first time in their lives, and Miguel had already covered his walls with drawings of horses and chickens. The work Jake had described was real, but manageable. His financial records were indeed a mess. Receipts stuffed in shoeboxes, invoices filed randomly, bank statements scattered across his desk. Maria spent her mornings organizing everything into a system that made sense, setting up spreadsheets to track income and expenses, and creating a filing system that even Jake could follow. "You're a miracle worker," Jake told her one afternoon, watching as she showed him how to use the new system on his computer. "I can actually find things now." "It's just organization," Maria said, but she felt proud. It had been a long time since anyone had appreciated her skills for something other than baking bread. The cooking arrangement had evolved naturally. The first week, Maria had prepared meals just for herself and the children in the cottage kitchen. But Jake's meals seemed to consist mostly of canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches, and Maria's upbringing wouldn't let her ignore someone who wasn't eating properly. She started by bringing him a plate when she made dinner for her family. Just an extra serving of whatever they were having. Nothing fancy, just real food. Jake had been so grateful for those simple meals that Maria began planning larger portions, cooking enough for all four of them. Soon they were eating dinner together most nights, either in the main house kitchen or outside on the porch when the weather was nice. Jake was a good listener, asking Sophia about school and encouraging Miguel's endless questions about ranch life. The children, who had been shy and withdrawn for months after their father's death, began to relax and open up. "Can Jake teach me to ride Buttercup tomorrow?" Miguel asked one evening as Maria tucked him into his bed. "If he has time and if you've done your homework," Maria replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I like it here, Mama," Miguel said sleepily. "It's quiet but not scary quiet. It's peaceful quiet." From the mouths of babes, Maria thought. Miguel had put his finger on exactly what made the ranch feel different from the city. In their old apartment, silence had meant loneliness and worry. Here, silence meant safety and space to breathe. Sophia was thriving too, though she showed it differently. She had always been the responsible one, the child who tried to take care of everyone else. Here, for the first time in months, she was acting like a kid again. She built forts in the pasture, collected eggs from the chickens, and had started a small garden behind the cottage with Jake's help. "She has a natural talent for growing things," Jake told Maria one evening as they watched Sophia water her tomato plants. "Look how carefully she tends to each one." Maria felt a familiar pang watching her daughter. Sophia was so much like her father, patient and nurturing with growing things. Diego would have been proud to see her caring for plants and animals with such dedication. Jake seemed to understand Maria's moments of sadness without her having to explain them. He never pushed her to talk about Diego, but he didn't avoid the subject either. When Maria mentioned her husband in conversation, Jake listened respectfully, sometimes sharing brief stories about Lisa in return. "It gets easier," he told her one evening after the children had gone to bed and they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "Not better exactly, but easier. The sharp edges wear down a little." Maria nodded, grateful for his honesty. People always told her that time healed all wounds. But Jake understood that some wounds just learn to live alongside you, rather than disappearing completely. The ranch itself was beginning to feel like home in ways Maria hadn't expected. She loved the morning routine of collecting eggs and feeding the chickens. She enjoyed the challenge of organizing Jake's business records and the satisfaction of seeing everything run more smoothly. Most of all, she loved watching her children rediscover their childhood joy. Jake was an ideal employer and housemate. He was respectful of their privacy, never entering the cottage without being invited but always available when they needed something. He fixed Miguel's broken toy truck without being asked, helped Sophia with her math homework when Maria was stumped, and never made Maria feel like she owed him more than the work they had agreed upon. But Maria was beginning to realize that her feelings about Jake were becoming more complicated than simple gratitude. She noticed the way he was gentle with the animals, patient with her children, and quietly thoughtful in everything he did. She noticed how he always made sure there was coffee ready when she came to work on the books in the morning, and how he stocked the cottage kitchen with groceries before she even realized they were running low on something. Most of all, she noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, not with expectation or demand, but with a kind of quiet appreciation that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since Diego died. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner together, their hands brushed as they reached for the same dish. Instead of pulling away immediately, they both paused, and Maria felt something she hadn't felt in almost 2 years. A flutter of attraction, an awareness of Jake as not just a kind employer, but as a man. The moment passed quickly, but Maria lay awake that night thinking about it. She felt guilty for feeling anything romantic about anyone other than Diego. But she also felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, someday, she might be ready to open her heart again. Jake seemed to be going through his own process of healing. Maria had seen pictures of Lisa around the house, a beautiful woman with a bright smile who looked like she had made Jake very happy. But she also noticed that Jake was beginning to seem less lonely, more connected to life around him. "Thank you," he said to Maria one evening as they watched the children play in the yard. "For what?" Maria asked. "For bringing life back to this place," Jake said simply. "I didn't realize how empty it had become until it was full again." Maria understood. The ranch wasn't just healing her family, they were helping heal Jake too. It was a partnership that went deeper than employer and employee, deeper than landlord and tenant. They were helping each other build new lives from the pieces of their old ones. As autumn turned toward winter, Maria began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were all going to be okay. By spring, the ranch had transformed into something none of them had expected when Maria first arrived with her children 6 months earlier. What had started as a practical arrangement between two people, trying to heal from loss, had grown into something that felt like family. Maria's bread baking had resumed in a way that brought her more joy than it had since Diego's death. Jake's kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, and Maria found herself experimenting with new recipes, baking not just for survival, but for the pleasure of creating something beautiful. She started selling her bread at the local farmers market in town and at 2 neighboring communities. Word spread quickly about the delicious bread made by the woman at the Williams Ranch, and soon Maria had more orders than she could handle. Sophia had blossomed in her new school. She was at the top of her class, had made several close friends, and had joined the school's environmental club. She still helped Jake with the ranch animals every day after school, and had convinced him to start a composting program that turned kitchen scraps into rich soil for her growing garden. Miguel had become Jake's shadow, following him around the ranch and learning everything there was to know about caring for horses, fixing fences, and maintaining equipment. At 6 years old, he could already saddle Buttercup by himself and had learned to drive Jake's old tractor around the property. But more importantly, he was laughing again every day, his natural cheerfulness restored. The moment Maria knew she had fallen in love with Jake came on a rainy April morning when she was running late, getting the children ready for school. She had overslept after staying up late filling a large bread order, and everything seemed to be going wrong. Sophia couldn't find her science project. Miguel had spilled cereal all over his school clothes, and Maria realized she had forgotten to pack their lunches the night before. She was rushing around, trying to solve 3 problems at once when she heard Jake's calm voice from the kitchen. "Sophia, your project is right here on the counter where you left it last night," he said. "Miguel, buddy, let's get you into some clean clothes. I've got a shirt that might work." When Maria hurried into the kitchen 10 minutes later, she found Jake braiding Sophia's hair while Miguel sat at the table eating pancakes that definitely hadn't been there when she left the room. 2 perfectly packed lunchboxes sat by the door, and Jake had Sophia's science project safely stored in a protective folder. "How did you—" Maria started to ask. "I heard the commotion and figured you might need an extra pair of hands," Jake said, putting the finishing touches on Sophia's braid. "There's coffee for you in the thermos, and I already warmed up the car." Maria stood in the doorway watching this kind, patient man taking care of her children like they were his own, and something shifted permanently in her chest. This wasn't just gratitude anymore, or friendship, or even attraction. This was love, deep and real and completely unexpected. Jake's realization came later that same day, when Maria sliced her hand while cutting bread for the evening's baking. It wasn't a serious cut, but there was blood, and Maria was standing at the sink trying to run cold water over it while wrapping a kitchen towel around her palm. "Let me see," Jake said, appearing beside her before she even realized he had heard her small cry of pain. Without thinking, he took her injured hand in both of his, gently unwrapping the towel to examine the cut. His hands were so much larger than hers, calloused and rough from ranch work, but infinitely gentle as he cleaned the wound and applied antiseptic from the first aid kit. "It's not deep," he said softly, "but it's going to need a few stitches. I'll drive you to Dr. Martinez." "It's nothing," Maria protested, but Jake was already getting his keys and calling to the children that they were going to take their mother to see the doctor. As Jake carefully bandaged her hand in the doctor's office, Maria watched his face, saw the concentration and concern in his expression, and realized that somewhere along the way, he had started caring for her as much more than just an employee or friend. The awareness between them grew slowly after that, like sunrise creeping across the ranch in the early morning. There were small moments, Jake's hand lingering on Maria's shoulder when he brought her coffee, Maria finding excuses to brush past him in the kitchen, both of them staying up later in the evenings, talking on the porch long after the children had gone to bed. One evening in late May, as they watched Sophia and Miguel play with the new kittens that had been born in the barn, Jake turned to Maria and said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Maria's heart started beating faster. "What is it?" I know this wasn't part of our original agreement, Jake said, his voice careful and uncertain. And if it makes you uncomfortable, we can pretend I never said anything. But I think I'm falling in love with you. Maria felt tears start in her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. Jake, I know it's complicated, he continued quickly. I know we both loved other people, and I don't want to dishonor their memory. But being with you and the kids these past months, it's made me feel alive again in a way I thought I never would. I love you too, Maria said, the words coming out in a rush. I've been trying not to feel it because I felt guilty, like I was betraying Diego's memory. But I can't help it. You've given us so much more than just a place to live. You've given us a family again. That night, after the children were asleep, Jake and Maria sat on the porch swing he had installed the previous month. They talked until dawn about their fears, their hopes, and the complicated emotions of finding love after loss. They agreed to take things slowly, to make sure the children were comfortable with the change in their relationship, and to honor the memory of the people they had loved before. Diego would want me to be happy, Maria said as the sun rose over the pasture. He would want the children to have a good father figure in their lives. Lisa always said that love multiplies, it doesn't divide, Jake replied, his arm around Maria's shoulders. She would want me to love again, not to spend the rest of my life alone. The children, it turned out, had been hoping for exactly this development. When Jake and Maria told them that they had feelings for each other and wanted to explore the possibility of becoming a real family, Sophia clapped her hands and Miguel asked if that meant Jake would officially be their dad. If that's what you want, Jake told them seriously. But you'll always be your father's children too. Diego will always be part of your family even though he can't be here with us. Can we have two dads? Miguel asked. One who's in heaven watching us and one who's here taking care of us? I think that sounds perfect, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Jake Williams married Maria Santos in the same farmer's market where they had first met. The ceremony was small but perfect, surrounded by the vendors who had watched their love story unfold, the neighbors from their small town who had welcomed Maria and her children, and the few family members who could make the trip. Sophia served as maid of honor, wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves that she had picked out herself. Miguel was the ring bearer, taking his job so seriously that he practiced walking with the rings for weeks beforehand. Jake wore his best shirt and the bolo tie that had belonged to his grandfather. Maria wore a simple white dress that made her look radiant and happy. Mrs. Chen provided flowers from her garden. Tom made the coffee for the reception, and Maria had baked their wedding cake herself. 3 layers of the bread-based cake recipe that Diego's grandmother had taught her, covered in cream cheese frosting and decorated with fresh berries. As they exchanged vows, Maria thought about the morning nearly 2 years earlier, when she had stood in this same market, crying over her bread stall and certain that her world was ending. She never could have imagined that her moment of deepest despair would lead to this moment of perfect joy. Jake's vows were simple and heartfelt. Maria, you and Sophia and Miguel brought light back into my life when I thought I would spend forever in darkness. I promise to love you, to protect your family, to honor Diego's memory, and to build a future with you that's worthy of the love that brought us together. Maria's vows came from the deepest part of her heart. Jake, you saved us when we had nowhere else to turn, but more than that, you showed me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It multiplies and grows and makes room for new people to love. I promise to love you, to build this ranch into a home for all of us, and to never forget that kindness can change everything. The reception was held right there in the market, with music from a local bluegrass band and dancing between the vegetable stands. Sophia and Miguel ran around with the other children, their faces glowing with happiness. Maria danced with Jake as the sun set behind the market stalls, surrounded by their friends and neighbors, and felt more grateful than she had ever thought possible. That evening, as they drove back to the ranch as a married couple, the children asleep in the back seat, Maria looked at the wedding ring on her finger, not expensive, but chosen with love, and then at Jake's profile as he drove through the familiar countryside. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't decided to walk through the market that day? She asked him. Jake smiled and reached over to take her hand. I don't wonder about it, he said.